The carriage wheel cracked against a stone hidden in the mud, and Aloan Hartley was thrown forward so hard that her shoulder struck the door. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Somewhere beyond the fogged glass, a horse screamed, and the whole carriage tilted sideways before jerking to a stop at a dangerous angle over a ditch. She did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming did nothing except waste breath a person might need for climbing out of trouble. Instead, she braced her boots against the opposite seat and waited for the tilting to stop, her heart slamming against her ribs, her fingers gripping the strap above the window until her knuckles turned white. Outside, a man's voice cut through the storm, low and commanding, ordering the driver to cut the injured horse free before it dragged the whole carriage into the water. Aloan pressed her face to the glass and saw him for the first time, a tall figure in a dark coat, soaked through, moving with a calm that seemed almost unnatural given the chaos around him. He did not shout the way frightened men shouted. He gave instructions the way a man gives instructions when he has already decided exactly what must happen next. The door was wrenched open, and rain lashed straight into her face. "Give me your hand," he said, not a request, barely even a command, just a fact stated plainly as though there were no other reasonable action to take. She did not know yet that this man was Ashford Vane, the Duke of Oswaldby, a name whispered across 3 counties with equal parts admiration and fear. She only knew that the ditch was rising with rainwater, and that the carriage groaned every few seconds like it might finally give up and roll. She took his hand. His grip was firm, almost bruising, and he pulled her out into the storm with one motion, as though she weighed nothing at all. For a moment they stood pressed close together on the muddy verge, rain streaming down both their faces, the ruined carriage tilting behind them, the frightened horses being led away by 2 soaked grooms. He looked at her properly then, not the polite, glancing look a gentleman gives a stranger. A real look, sharp and searching, as though he were trying to determine something important about her in the space of 2 seconds. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said, though her shoulder throbbed where she had struck the door. "Only shaken." "Good," he said, and released her hand immediately, stepping back as though he had only just noticed how close they were standing. "You will ride the rest of the way in my carriage. Yours will not move again tonight." It was not a question. Aloan opened her mouth to object, to insist she could wait for another arrangement, that she did not know this man and had no wish to be indebted to a stranger on a dark road in the middle of a storm. But the wind snatched the words from her before she could shape them properly, and in the end, soaked and shivering and with nowhere else to go, she followed him. His carriage was warm and dry, lit by a single lantern that swayed gently with the motion of the wheels once they were moving again. He sat across from her, his coat dripping onto the floor, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and for a long while neither of them spoke. She studied him without meaning to. There was something unreadable in his face, a stillness that felt deliberate, as though he had trained himself over many years to give nothing away. "You are traveling to Oswaldby Hall," he said at last. It was not a question either. "How do you know that?" "Because there is nothing else on this road for another 10 miles, and because the Dowager Duchess mentioned she was expecting a new companion this week." His gaze flicked over her damp, travel-worn dress, her plain bonnet now ruined by rain, the small case she had managed to grab from the wreck. "You must be Miss Hartley." She straightened, suddenly very aware of how she must look, bedraggled and plain beside this composed, expensively dressed stranger. "I am, and you are." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Amusement, perhaps, or something closer to relief that she did not already know. "A friend of the house," he said, which was not an answer at all, and turned his face toward the window, ending the conversation as cleanly as if he had shut a door. She did not press him. She had learned in 3 years of service in other people's houses that some doors were better left closed until a person decided to open them on their own. The rest of the journey passed in silence, broken only by the rhythm of rain and wheels. When the carriage finally pulled through the iron gates of Oswaldby Hall, Aloan caught her first glimpse of the house through the storm, an enormous shape of stone and shadow, its windows glowing faintly gold against the black sky. It looked less like a home and more like something that had grown out of the earth over centuries, indifferent to the people who passed through it. The carriage stopped beneath a covered entrance, and a footman rushed forward with an umbrella before the door had even fully opened. The stranger stepped out first and offered his hand again, and again she took it, because refusing seemed foolish when the ground was slick with rain. "Thank you," she said, "for the carriage and for pulling me out of that ditch." "You would have managed on your own," he said. "You did not scream." It was such a strange thing to say that she almost laughed. Is that meant to be a compliment? It is meant to be an observation. He studied her again with that same unsettling directness. Most people scream. "You did not." Before she could think of a reply, an older woman's voice rang out from the doorway, sharp with irritation and relief in equal measure. "There you are. I was told the West Road had flooded and feared you were both drowned in a ditch somewhere." The Dowager Duchess of Oswaldby stood framed in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the hall behind her, her silver hair pinned severely back, her eyes moving quickly between Alowan and the stranger with obvious curiosity. "Miss Hartley, I presume. You are soaked through. Come inside at once before you catch your death." Alowan moved toward the door, grateful for the warmth spilling out from within, but she paused when the dowager's gaze shifted past her to the man still standing in the rain. "And you," the dowager said, her voice softening into something almost fond, though still edged with exasperation, "might have sent word ahead that you intended to play rescuer on the West Road tonight. Come in, Ashford, before you frighten the staff standing about like a ghost." Alowan went very still. "Ashford." The name settled over her slowly, like the cold rain still clinging to her shoulders. She turned to look at him properly, this time with new eyes, understanding all at once who had pulled her from the wreckage of her carriage with such calm, unbothered strength. The Duke of Oswaldby did not smile at her recognition. He only inclined his head slightly, the barest acknowledgement, before stepping past her into the warmth of the hall as though the last half-hour had meant nothing at all to him. But it had meant something to her, and she suspected, though she could not have said exactly why, that it had meant something to him too. Inside, the hall was grand in a way that made Alowan feel very small and very plain. High ceilings disappeared into shadow above her, portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, and a fire roared in a hearth large enough to stand inside. A maid appeared almost instantly to take her wet things, and within minutes she found herself seated near the fire, a cup of something warm pressed into her hands, while the dowager fussed over her with a briskness that did not quite hide genuine concern. "You will forgive the state of things," the dowager said, settling into the chair opposite her. "This house does not often receive guests in the middle of a storm. Now tell me, Miss Hartley, how badly were you shaken?" "Only a bruised shoulder," Alowan said. "The Duke was very capable in the crisis." "He usually is capable," the dowager said, with a strange dryness in her voice, as though the word capable carried more weight than it should. "It is feeling that gives him trouble." Alowan did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the dowager did not explain further, moving instead into a brisk explanation of Alowan's duties, the household routines, the wing of the house where she would sleep, all delivered with the efficient warmth of a woman who had clearly run this household for many years, and intended to keep running it exactly as she pleased. Later that night, after she had been shown to a small but comfortable room and left alone at last, Alowan sat by her window and watched the storm finally begin to weaken outside. Her shoulder ached. Her clothes, hung near the fire to dry, still smelled of rain and mud. And yet her mind kept circling back not to the wreck, not to the fear of the tilting carriage, but to the stillness in the Duke's face when he had asked her so simply if she was hurt. She had come to Oswaldby Hall expecting nothing more than quiet work and a roof over her head, a position secured through a family friend after her father's small income had finally proven too small to support them both. She had not expected a Duke pulling her from a ditch in the rain, nor the strange, unreadable calm with which he had done it, nor the way his eyes had lingered on her face a moment longer than politeness required. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not notice Vickers' daughters, not in any way that mattered, and she had no intention of being foolish enough to imagine otherwise. But when she finally closed her eyes that night, it was not the crack of the carriage wheel or the scream of the horse that lingered in her memory. It was his voice, low and certain in the storm, asking if she was hurt, as though her answer genuinely mattered to him. She did not yet know how much that single night would come to matter. She only knew, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, that something in her had shifted, quietly and without permission, the moment she had taken his hand. Morning came gray and washed clean by the storm, the grounds outside her window glistening with rain that had not yet dried. Elowen rose early out of habit, dressed in her plainest gown, and made her way downstairs uncertain of where exactly she was meant to go or what her first day would require of her. She found the dowager already awake, seated at a small table in a sunlit morning room, a stack of letters beside her untouched breakfast. "Ah, good, you are an early riser," the dowager said, waving her into the seat opposite. "I cannot abide companions who sleep until noon and expect to be waited on. Sit, eat, and then we shall begin properly. I have a great many letters that need answering, and my eyes are not what they once were." Elowen sat, grateful for the simplicity of the task, grateful too for the ordinary rhythm of work after the strangeness of the night before. She spent the morning reading correspondence aloud, taking dictation in a careful hand, listening to the dowager's sharp, often amusing commentary on the various relatives and acquaintances whose letters crossed her desk. It was easy work, familiar work, the kind she had done in other houses before this one, and by midday she had almost convinced herself that the storm, the wreck, and the Duke's steady grip on her hand had been nothing more than an unusual beginning to an otherwise ordinary position. She did not see him again until the following afternoon, when she was crossing the long gallery on an errand for the dowager, and found him standing before one of the portraits, entirely still, his hands clasped behind his back. She might have passed without disturbing him, but he spoke without turning. "Miss Hartley." She stopped. "Your Grace." "Your shoulder," he said, "is it improved?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was unkind, but because it was so precisely, unexpectedly considerate. "Much improved, thank you." He turned to look at her then, and in the pale daylight of the gallery she could see him more clearly than she had in the storm. He was younger than she had first assumed, perhaps only a handful of years older than herself, though something in his bearing suggested a weariness that did not belong to a young man. His eyes were a deep, storm-colored gray, and they studied her now with the same unsettling directness she remembered from the road. "You did not tell me your full name," he said. "The dowager mentioned it, but I would rather hear it from you." "Elowen," she said, "Elowen Hartley." "Elowen," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "An unusual name." "My mother was fond of unusual things," she said. "I am told it means elm tree, though I have never verified that myself." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to soften the sharp lines of his face. "Strong wood, difficult to break." "I hope that was meant kindly." "It was meant honestly," he said. "I find I have little patience left for anything else." Before she could ask what he meant by that, a servant appeared at the end of the gallery, informing him that his steward awaited him in the study on a matter of some urgency. The Duke inclined his head toward Elowen, the same small, precise gesture from the night of the storm, and walked away without another word, leaving her standing alone in the long gallery beneath the silent, watchful eyes of 100 painted ancestors. She did not understand him. She was not certain in that moment that anyone did. But she found, as she continued on her errand, that she was already looking forward, in some small and reluctant corner of her mind, to the next time their paths would cross. Over the following days, Elowen settled slowly into the rhythm of the house. She learned the names of the staff, the location of the library the dowager insisted she use freely, the particular creak of the third stair that announced anyone's approach long before they arrived. She learned, too, that the Duke of Oswaldby was a man of habits, precise and unvarying, rising early, riding out most mornings regardless of weather, and retreating each evening to his study where lamplight burned late into the night. She saw him often but spoke to him rarely, their exchanges brief and formal, exactly as they should be between a duke and his grandmother's companion. And yet she began to notice small things. The way his gaze would linger a moment too long when their paths crossed in a corridor. The way he seemed, without ever quite admitting it, to arrange his morning rides to pass the garden path where she often walked with the dowager's small dog. The way the household staff, who missed very little, had already begun exchanging glances whenever his name was mentioned in the same breath as her own. She told herself, firmly and often, that it meant nothing. A duke did not concern himself with a companion of no fortune and no particular beauty, whatever small kindness the circumstances of their meeting had produced. She had her work, her modest wages, her quiet gratitude for a roof and a fire, and she intended to want nothing more than that. But on the 6th evening of her employment, walking the upper corridor on her way to bed with a single candle lighting her path, she passed a door she had not noticed before, tucked into an alcove at the far end of the hall, and found it, for reasons she could not later explain, standing slightly ajar. She should have walked on. She knew that even as she slowed her steps, even as her candle flickered against the dark wood of the door, even as some quiet, curious part of her leaned closer to see what lay beyond it. The room within was small and dim, the furniture draped in pale cloth, the air heavy with the particular stillness of a place long undisturbed. A rocking horse stood in one corner, its paint faded, its mane worn thin from small hands that had long since stopped reaching for it. A child's bed sat against the far wall, neatly made, as though waiting for someone who would never return to sleep in it. Eloise stood frozen in the doorway, her candle trembling slightly in her hand, understanding without being told exactly what kind of room this was, and exactly why it had been shut away from the rest of the house. She heard footsteps behind her a moment too late. "You should not be here." She turned quickly, her heart lurching, to find the Duke standing several feet away in the corridor, his face illuminated strangely by the low light, his expression unlike anything she had seen from him before. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to a wound reopened without warning. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "The door was open. I did not mean to intrude." He did not answer immediately. His gaze moved past her, into the room, resting for a long moment on the small, faded rocking horse in the corner, and something in his face closed like a fist. "It is my brother's room," he said finally, his voice quiet in a way she had not heard from him before, stripped of its usual composure. "He died when he was 7 years old. No one has entered that room in 11 years. Eloise did not know what to say. She thought of offering condolences, of the practiced, gentle words she had used before in other houses when confronted with other people's grief. But something told her that such words would land wrong here, too small for whatever silence had been kept in this room for so long. So instead, she said nothing at all. She stepped back from the doorway, reached for the handle, and gently, carefully closed the door until the latch clicked softly into place, sealing the small, sorrowful room away once more. When she turned back to him, he was watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between surprise and something far more fragile, as though he had expected her to ask questions, to pry, to offer the kind of hollow sympathy people so often offered grief they did not understand, and had instead been given only quiet. "Thank you," he said at last, so softly she almost did not hear it. "You do not need to explain yourself to me, Your Grace," she said gently. "Everyone is entitled to keep certain doors closed." Something shifted in his face then, the faintest easing of the tension that seemed to live permanently along his jaw. And for a moment, standing together in the dim corridor with a single candle burning low between them, Eloise felt the strange, unmistakable sense that she had been given a glimpse of something very few people were ever allowed to see. "Good night, Miss Hartley," he said finally, stepping back, his composure returning like a curtain drawn closed. "Good night, Your Grace." She walked the rest of the way to her room in silence, her candle guttering low, her mind turning over what she had witnessed. She did not yet understand the full weight of what lay behind that closed door, the guilt and grief the Duke of Oswaldby carried so carefully hidden beneath his composed exterior. But she understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that something had passed between them in that corridor that neither of them would easily forget. And though she told herself once again, climbing into her narrow bed as the candle finally died, that it meant nothing, that a duke's grief was not hers to carry and his gratitude was not hers to treasure, she found herself thinking of his voice, low and unguarded, saying thank you as though she had given him something precious. She did not know, not yet, that she had. The days that followed the night of the closed room felt different to Aloan, though she could not have explained exactly how. Nothing had changed in any way another person might notice. The Duke still rose early, still rode out in most weathers, still retreated to his study each evening with the same unwavering routine. And yet something in the air between them had shifted, quietly, the way the temperature shifts before a storm arrives, unnoticed until it is already upon you. She found herself watching for him now, not deliberately, but in the way a person watches for a familiar shape without quite admitting to themselves that they are looking. She noticed when his study window still glowed past midnight. She noticed when he skipped his morning ride, and noticed too when he resumed it the following day as though nothing had interrupted it at all. She told herself this was simple curiosity, the natural interest one takes in the household one serves, and did her best not to examine the feeling any more closely than that. The dowager, for her part, seemed to notice everything, as she always did, though she said nothing directly. She had a habit of watching Aloan over the rim of her teacup with a small, knowing look whenever the Duke's name arose in conversation, and once, quite without warning, she said, "My grandson does not often speak more than 3 words together to anyone in this house. You should know that whatever exchange passed between you the other night was, for him, something close to a confession." Aloan had nearly dropped the letter she was holding. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace." "Of course you do," the dowager said mildly, returning her attention to her tea as though she had said nothing of consequence at all. "You are not a foolish girl. I would not have hired you if you were." Aloan had no answer for that, and the dowager did not press further, moving instead into a discussion of an upcoming dinner she intended to host for several families from the neighboring estates. But the words lingered with Aloan long after the conversation had moved elsewhere, settling into her thoughts like a stone dropped into still water, spreading ripples she could not quite control. It was nearly a week later that she encountered the Duke again in any meaningful way, this time in the library, where she had gone in search of a book the dowager had requested. She had not expected him to be there. He so rarely used the library, preferring, she had gathered, the solitude of his study, and so she was startled to find him seated near the tall windows, a book open on his knee though his eyes were fixed on the grounds outside rather than the page before him. "Forgive me," she said quickly, already turning to leave. "I did not know you were here. I will return another time." "You need not go," he said, without turning from the window. "The library belongs to the house, not to me alone, whatever the deeds might say." She hesitated, then stepped further into the room, moving carefully along the shelves in search of the volume the dowager had asked for, acutely aware of him the entire time, the quiet weight of his presence filling the room in a way she found difficult to ignore. "You are looking for something specific," he observed, watching her now. "A book on garden design. Your grandmother has decided the east lawn requires improvement, though I confess I know very little about gardens beyond the fact that they require patience." "Third shelf near the window," he said. "My mother kept a great many books on gardens." She found them soothing. Aloan found the shelf he indicated and located the book easily enough, running her fingers along its worn spine before pulling it free. "Thank you." "You are welcome." He closed his own book at last, setting it aside, and regarded her with the same searching look she had come to associate with him, as though he were perpetually trying to solve some puzzle she presented without meaning to. "May I ask you something, Miss Hartley?" "You may ask. I cannot promise a satisfactory answer." The faintest curve touched his mouth, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Why did you not ask me about the room? Most people, upon discovering such a thing, would want to know everything. The circumstances, the details. They would offer their sympathy whether or not it was wanted, simply to fill the silence." Alowan considered the question carefully before answering, sensing that he genuinely wanted the truth rather than a polite deflection. "Because grief is not a story owed to strangers," she said finally. "You did not choose to show me that room. I stumbled into something private, and the least I could do afterward was not treat your loss as entertainment for my curiosity." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet held her still exactly where she stood. "You are unlike most people who come through this house," he said at last. "Is that a compliment, Your Grace, or an observation?" "Both," he said, echoing, perhaps deliberately, the words she had used to him days before. "I find I have grown tired of people who want something from me. My title, my fortune, my name attached to theirs at a dinner party. You seem to want nothing at all." "I want my wages paid on time and a quiet place to sleep," she said lightly, hoping to ease the sudden weight in the room. "Beyond that, I confess my ambitions are quite small." This time his smile reached his eyes, brief but unmistakably genuine, and something in Alowan's chest tightened at the sight of it, as though she had been given a rare and unexpected gift. "Small ambitions suit you," he said, "though I suspect you are capable of a great deal more than you allow yourself to want." She did not know how to answer that, and he did not seem to expect an answer, rising instead from his chair and crossing to where she stood near the shelves. He was close enough now that she could see the faint shadows beneath his eyes, evidence of the late hours he kept, and close enough too that she was suddenly, uncomfortably aware of how very tall he was, how the library seemed smaller with him standing in it. "I owe you a debt," he said quietly, "for the night in the corridor, for your silence." "You owe me nothing. I only closed a door." "You closed it the right way," he said. "Most people, seeing what you saw, would have wanted to open it wider, to understand, to comfort, to fix. You simply let it be shut. That is rarer than you know." Alowan felt something warm and unfamiliar rise in her chest, a feeling she did not have a name for and was not entirely certain she wanted one for, given the vast, uncrossable distance that separated a duke from a vicar's penniless daughter. She stepped back slightly, putting a small but necessary space between them, and clutched the garden book to her chest like a shield. "I should return this to your grandmother," she said. "She does not like to be kept waiting." "No," he agreed, something like reluctance flickering across his face before he stepped back as well, allowing her the space she had created. "She does not." Alowan left the library quickly, her heart beating faster than the short walk warranted, and did not look back to see whether he watched her go. She suspected, without needing to look, that he did. That evening, at dinner, the dowager seemed in unusually high spirits, discussing at length her plans for the garden and the upcoming dinner party with the neighboring families, occasionally directing pointed questions at her grandson about matters of household business that he answered with brief, distracted precision. Alowan ate quietly at the far end of the table, as was proper for a companion, and did her best not to notice how often the Duke's gaze drifted toward her over the course of the meal, nor how quickly he looked away each time she caught him at it. It became, over the following weeks, an unspoken pattern between them. Brief exchanges in corridors and gardens, careful conversations in the library that stretched longer each time, despite both their evident efforts to keep them short, small kindnesses offered without acknowledgement, a book left on a table she was known to favor, a particular path in the garden kept clear of fallen branches after a storm, though neither of them ever spoke directly of what was growing between them. Alowan told herself, night after night, that she was imagining the significance of it all, that dukes did not fall for companions regardless of quiet gardens and closed doors, and shared confidences in dim corridors. But she found, increasingly, that she looked forward to each small exchange with a hunger she was not proud of, and that the house, which had felt so vast and unfamiliar upon her arrival, had slowly begun to feel like something closer to home, not because of the grand rooms or the roaring fires, but because of the particular way Ashford Vane looked at her, as though she were the only steady thing in a life otherwise built on duty and grief. The household staff, as households always do, had begun to notice as well. Elowen caught the housekeeper exchanging a knowing glance with the butler one afternoon when the Duke lingered in the breakfast room longer than usual, waiting, it seemed, for Elowen to appear with the morning correspondence. She caught, too, a younger maid whispering to another as she passed, something about the master smiling more often than he had in years, the words dying quickly when they noticed her overhearing. She did not know what to do with such observations except to carry them quietly, turning them over in her mind late at night when sleep would not come easily, wondering what exactly was happening between herself and a man so far above her station that the very idea of anything more than polite acquaintance should have seemed absurd. But absurd or not, it was happening, slowly and carefully, in the small spaces between duty and propriety, in closed doors and garden paths and library shelves, and Elowen was beginning to understand, with a mixture of hope and dread she could not entirely separate, that she was no longer simply a companion in this house. She was becoming something else entirely, something she did not yet have the courage to name, and she suspected, from the way his eyes lingered on her each time they parted, that the Duke of Oswaldby felt exactly the same uncertain, dangerous pull. Neither of them spoke of it, not yet. But the silence between them had begun to carry a weight of its own, heavy and warm and impossible to ignore. And Elowen understood, walking the quiet corridors of Oswaldby Hall each evening, that something was building toward a moment neither of them would be able to avoid forever. By the time autumn had settled fully over Oswaldby Hall, painting the grounds in shades of amber and rust, Elowen had begun to understand the rhythms of the house well enough to move through it with something close to ease. She knew which servants could be trusted with a private word, and which could not. She knew the dowager's moods well enough to predict them before they arrived. And she knew, though she still refused to examine the knowledge too closely, the particular sound of the Duke's footsteps in the corridor outside her small study, a rhythm she had come, without meaning to listen for. Their conversations had grown longer, bolder, less careful than they had been in those first weeks. What had begun as brief exchanges in passing had become something closer to genuine sparring, verbal contests neither of them seemed willing to lose, conducted in libraries and gardens, and on one particularly memorable afternoon, across the length of the dining table while the dowager looked on with poorly disguised delight. "You disapprove of my choice in reading material," the Duke said one evening, finding her curled in a window seat in the library with a worn novel in her lap, one she had borrowed without permission from his personal shelves. "I disapprove of nothing, Your Grace. I am simply surprised that a man so devoted to ledgers and estate matters keeps such a well-loved copy of a novel about pirates and stolen treasure." "Everyone is entitled to occasional foolishness," he said, settling into the chair across from her with an ease that had become familiar between them. "Even dukes. Especially dukes, I should think, given how little foolishness you allow yourselves in public." His mouth curved, that small, private smile she had come to treasure more than she was willing to admit. "And what foolishness would you have me indulge in, Miss Hartley? Should I take up dancing on tables, composing poor poetry, racing my horses down the public road for sport?" "I could not possibly advise a duke on proper foolishness," she said. "It is not a subject I have studied." "No," he agreed, his gaze softening in a way that made her chest tighten. "You have had very little room for foolishness in your life, I think." The observation landed closer to true than she wished to admit, and for a moment she said nothing, watching the fire crackle in the hearth rather than meet his eyes. Her father's small parish, the years of careful budgeting, the slow, quiet grief of watching her mother's health decline without the means to properly help her, the eventual necessity of seeking employment in other people's houses, because there was simply nothing left at home to sustain her. There had been little room, indeed, for foolishness in any of it. "You are quiet," he observed gently. "I have said something wrong." No, she said, shaking her head slightly. You have said something true. I am simply not accustomed to being seen so clearly. I find, he said, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, that I have grown rather skilled at seeing you clearly, Miss Hartley, whether you wish to be seen or not. The words hung between them, heavier than the casual tone in which he had spoken them, and Aloin felt her pulse quicken in a way that had become dangerously familiar over the past weeks. That is a bold thing to say to your grandmother's companion, she said, aiming for lightness though her voice betrayed her with the faintest tremor. Perhaps, he said, though I have never found much use in cowardice. She looked up at him then and found him watching her with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly very small, the fire too warm, the space between their chairs entirely too easy to close. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. And then, as though some invisible thread had snapped, he straightened abruptly, put a proper distance between them once more, and cleared his throat. I have kept you from your evening too long, he said, his voice returning to its usual composed register. Forgive me. There is nothing to forgive, she said quietly, though her heart was still racing as she watched him leave the room. It became, over the following weeks, a pattern they both seemed helpless to break, this slow, careful dance of drawing close and pulling back, of moments that threatened to become something more before one or the other of them retreated behind the safety of formality. Aloin told herself each time that this would be the last such moment, that she would guard herself more carefully in future, that a duke's attention, however genuine it seemed, could only lead her toward heartbreak given the impossible gulf of station between them. And each time, without fail, she found herself drawn back into his orbit regardless of every sensible resolution she had made. The household, meanwhile, continued its quiet campaign of observation and speculation. The housekeeper, a stern but not unkind woman named Marjorie, took to finding small excuses to seek Aloin out, offering pointed comments about how the master had not smiled so often in the 11 years since his brother's death, how the staff had begun placing wagers on how long it would take before something was formally declared. Aloin did her best to dismiss such talk, insisting there was nothing between herself and the Duke beyond simple friendliness, but Marjorie only laughed, a knowing, weathered sound, and returned to her duties without further comment. It was during a walk through the garden on a crisp October afternoon that matters shifted more decisively than either of them had perhaps intended. Aloin had taken the dowager's small dog, a fat, wheezing creature named Pepper, for its daily exercise along the gravel paths, and had not expected to encounter the Duke there, though she found, upon later reflection, that she was rarely surprised anymore by how often their paths seemed to cross. He was standing near the old stone fountain at the center of the garden, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unusually troubled. "Your Grace," she said, approaching carefully, Pepper trotting ahead of her toward the fountain's edge. "You look as though you are carrying the weight of the entire estate on your shoulders this morning." "Perhaps I am," he said, not turning immediately. "I received a letter this morning." "From Lady Vaughan." Aloin felt something cold settle in her stomach at the name, though she could not have said exactly why, having never heard it mentioned before. "I do not know the name." "You would not," he said. "It belongs to a chapter of my life I have worked very hard to keep closed, much like the room you found weeks ago." He finally turned to face her, and she saw, for the first time since the night in the corridor, that same fragile vulnerability beneath his usual composure. "Lady Cecilia Vaughan and I were, for a time, expected to marry. An arrangement between our families, made when we were both quite young, long before either of us had any say in the matter. And now she writes to you," Aloin said carefully, "after some time apart. Now she writes to remind me that the arrangement was never formally dissolved," he said, his voice tightening. "That her father grows impatient, that certain obligations, however old, are not so easily set aside." Aloin did not know what to say. She felt, suddenly and acutely, the vast difference between herself and this man, a difference she had allowed herself to forget in the warmth of their growing closeness. He was a duke, bound by duty and family obligation in ways she could barely comprehend, tied to arrangements made before he had ever drawn breath, arrangements that had nothing at all to do with rocking horses and garden walks and quiet conversations in the library. "Will you honor it?" she asked, though she was not certain she wanted the answer. "I do not know," he said honestly. "I have spent 11 years honoring obligations I did not choose, my title, my estate. The expectations of everyone who looks to me for stability after my brother's death left this family reeling. I have grown very tired, Miss Hartley, of doing what is expected rather than what I want." "And what do you want?" she asked, the question slipping free before she could stop it. He looked at her then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch, a rawness she had not seen from him before, not even in the corridor outside his brother's room. "I think you already know the answer to that," he said quietly, "even if neither of us is brave enough to say it aloud." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged, the fountain trickling softly behind him, Pepper snuffling contentedly at the water's edge, entirely oblivious to the weight of what was passing between the two humans nearby. Eloan felt herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something she could not name and did not have the strength to resist, and for one breathless moment she believed he might close the remaining distance between them entirely. But then a voice called from the house, one of the footmen summoning the Duke to attend a visitor who had arrived unannounced, and the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. He stepped back, his composure sliding back into place like a mask, and offered her a brief, formal nod. "Forgive me," he said. "Duty calls as it so often does." "Of course," she said, though something in her chest ached at the sudden distance between them. "Go. I will see that Pepper does not fall into the fountain in your absence." He almost smiled at that, the ghost of the expression he so rarely allowed himself, and then turned and strode back toward the house, leaving Eloan alone with the dog and the fountain and the unsettling weight of everything he had almost said. She did not see him again until dinner that evening, where he sat unusually quiet at the head of the table, his gaze distracted, his usual precise attention to the Dowager's conversation noticeably absent. The Dowager, sharp as ever, noticed immediately. "You are distracted tonight, Ashford," she said, setting down her fork with a pointed clink against her plate. "Is this about the Vaughan letter? I heard the messenger arrived this morning." "It is nothing that need concern you, grandmother." "Everything concerning this family concerns me," the Dowager said firmly. "I raised you after your parents passed, and I buried your brother beside them. I have earned the right to concern myself with whatever troubles you." The Duke set down his own utensils, his jaw tightening in a way Eloan had come to recognize as genuine distress carefully controlled. "Lord Vaughan believes the old arrangement between his daughter and myself still stands. He wishes to discuss formalizing it before the season ends." The table fell silent. Eloan kept her eyes fixed carefully on her plate, acutely aware that whatever answer the Duke gave now would matter a great deal, though she had no right to hope for any particular outcome, given her own impossible position in this house. "And what do you intend to tell him?" the Dowager asked, her voice softer now, watchful. "I do not know yet," the Duke said quietly. "I have not decided." The conversation moved on after that, the Dowager steering it deliberately toward safer topics, but Eloan noticed, throughout the remainder of the meal, how often the Duke's gaze drifted toward her end of the table, quick and searching, before flicking away again each time their eyes met. That night, unable to sleep, Eloan wrapped herself in a shawl and made her way down to the library, hoping the quiet familiarity of the room might settle her restless thoughts. She did not expect to find him there, seated near the dying fire, a glass of something amber-colored held loosely in his hand, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I did not mean to intrude," she said, already turning to leave. "Stay," he said, not looking up. "Please." She hesitated, then crossed the room and settled into the chair opposite him, the same chair she had occupied so many times before during their careful, dangerous conversations. "You heard everything at dinner," he said after a long silence. "I did. And what do you think I should do?" The question startled her, both for its directness and for the fact that he seemed to genuinely want her opinion on a matter of such enormous personal consequence. "It is not my place to advise you on such things, Your Grace." "I am not asking you as my grandmother's companion," he said, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "I am asking you as a Lowen. What would you have me do?" She swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of the question settle over her. "I would have you do what makes you feel less like a man carrying out someone else's expectations," she said carefully, "and more like a man living his own life. But I recognize that is easy advice for someone with nothing to lose by giving it." "You have a great deal to lose," he said quietly, "more than you know." Before she could ask what he meant, he set down his glass and rose from his chair, crossing the small distance between them until he stood directly before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. "I have spent 11 years being exactly what everyone required me to be," he said, his voice low and rough with something she had not heard from him before. "Dutiful, composed, untouchable. I did not think there was room left in me for anything else, until a carriage broke down on the West Road, and a woman who did not scream climbed out of the wreckage and looked at me as though I were simply a man, rather than a title." "Ashford," she whispered, using his given name for the first time, the word feeling strange and thrilling on her tongue. Something in his face broke open at the sound of it, and for a moment she thought he might close the distance between them entirely. But then, with visible effort, he stepped back, running a hand roughly through his hair, putting the necessary space between them once more. "Forgive me," he said, his voice unsteady. "I should not have said any of that. It is unfair to you, given everything that binds me elsewhere." "You have nothing to apologize for," she said softly, though her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "I have a great deal to apologize for," he said, "beginning with allowing myself to feel something I have no right to feel for a woman who deserves far better than the tangled mess of obligations attached to my name." He left the library shortly after, and Aloin sat alone by the dying fire for a long while after he had gone, turning his words over in her mind, feeling the fragile, dangerous hope building in her chest despite every reasonable warning she gave herself against it. She did not know what would come of Lord Vaughan's letter, or the old arrangement it threatened to revive, or the impossible distance of station that stood between herself and the man who had just confessed, however carefully, that he felt something for her he had not expected to feel again. But she knew, sitting alone in the quiet library with the fire burning low, that whatever came next, there was no returning to the careful, distant politeness with which they had first regarded one another. Something had shifted between them irrevocably, and Aloin suspected that the coming weeks would test exactly how far either of them was willing to go in pursuit of what neither of them yet had the courage to name aloud. Lady Cecilia Vaughan arrived at Oswaldby Hall on a bright, cold morning 11 days later, her carriage far grander than anything Aloin had ever seen approach the house, drawn by 4 matched greys and trimmed in silver fittings that caught the morning light like polished ice. Aloin watched her arrival from an upstairs window, unable to help herself despite the small, uncomfortable knot forming in her stomach at the sight. Lady Vaughan stepped down from the carriage with the practiced grace of a woman who had never once doubted her welcome anywhere she chose to go. She was beautiful in the way that portraits were beautiful, every feature perfectly composed, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid the better part of an hour, her gown, a deep, expensive blue that Aloin suspected cost more than her own annual wages several times over. The Duke greeted her at the door himself, a formality Aloin had rarely seen him extend to visitors, and something in the easy, familiar way Lady Vaughan placed her gloved hand on his arm as they moved into the house spoke of years of shared history that Aloin could not hope to compete with. She told herself, watching from the window, that it did not matter to her one way or another whom the Duke chose to greet at his door. She told herself this several times over the course of the morning, with steadily diminishing success. The Dowager summoned her shortly before the midday meal, her expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put Aloan on guard. "Lady Vaughan will be staying with us for some time," the dowager said, watching Aloan's face closely as she spoke. "Her father has business with my grandson regarding certain family matters, and it was thought more convenient for her to remain here while the arrangements are discussed." "Of course, Your Grace," Aloan said, keeping her voice carefully even. "I shall see to it that her rooms are properly prepared." "That will not be necessary. Marjorie has already seen to it." The dowager's sharp eyes softened slightly, and she reached out to touch Aloan's hand briefly, an unusual gesture of comfort from a woman not given to such displays. "I would ask you to be sensible about this, my dear. Whatever passes between my grandson and Lady Vaughan in the coming weeks is a matter of old family obligation, nothing more. It need not concern you." Aloan understood, hearing this, that the dowager knew far more about her feelings for the Duke than she had ever admitted aloud, and understood too the gentle warning embedded in the older woman's words. She nodded, murmured her agreement, and returned to her duties with a heaviness in her chest she did her best to ignore. Lady Vaughan, as it turned out, was not unkind, which somehow made the entire situation more difficult to bear than if she had been. She was polite to the staff, generous with her compliments, and clearly, effortlessly comfortable in the grand rooms of Oswaldby Hall in a way that spoke of a lifetime spent among such houses. She treated Aloan with the pleasant, distant courtesy one extends to household staff, never unkind, never particularly interested either, and Aloan found herself, despite every effort not to, comparing herself unfavorably at every turn. The Duke's manner changed noticeably in Lady Vaughan's presence. Aloan watched, over the following days, as he retreated back into the composed, careful formality she remembered from their first meetings, the warmth that had grown between them over the past weeks folding neatly away beneath layers of duty and propriety. He escorted Lady Vaughan on walks through the garden. He sat beside her at dinner, engaged in conversation about mutual acquaintances and family history that Aloan had no part in. He was, in every visible way, exactly the dutiful, obligated Duke his position required him to be. Aloan told herself this was for the best. She told herself, lying awake each night in her narrow bed, that whatever fragile, foolish hope had grown in her over the past weeks had been exactly that, foolish, and that she should be grateful for the clarity Lady Vaughan's arrival had provided. A Duke belonged with a woman of equal station, a woman who understood the weight of the name she would carry, a woman who had grown up expecting exactly this life, rather than stumbling into its edges through a broken carriage wheel and a moment of shared vulnerability in a dim corridor. And yet, despite every sensible thought she forced herself to hold on to, she could not entirely ignore the small, telling moments that continued to pass between herself and the Duke even in Lady Vaughan's presence. The way his gaze would find hers across the dinner table when he thought no one was watching, quick and searching, before he forced his attention back to his guest. The way he seemed, on the rare occasions their paths crossed without witnesses, to linger a moment longer than necessary before continuing on his way. The way once, passing her in the corridor with Lady Vaughan on his arm, he had murmured a quiet apology that seemed to carry far more weight than the simple bump of shoulders that had prompted it. It was nearly a week into Lady Vaughan's visit that Aloan overheard a conversation she had not intended to hear, passing the open door of the Duke's study on an errand for the dowager, her footsteps slowing despite herself at the sound of Lady Vaughan's voice within. "You cannot mean to delay this any further, Ashford," Lady Vaughan was saying, her tone light but with an edge of genuine frustration beneath it. "Our fathers arranged this match when we were children. You know as well as I do that my father grows impatient, and that further delay only invites speculation neither of us can afford." "I am aware of the arrangement, Cecilia," the Duke said, his voice carefully controlled. "I have not forgotten it." "Then why do you hesitate?" A pause, and when Lady Vaughan spoke again, her voice had softened, taking on a different quality entirely. "Is it because of the girl?" Aloan's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should move on, should not linger to hear more, but her feet remained rooted to the spot despite every rational instinct urging her away. "I do not know what you mean," the Duke said, though something in his tone suggested he understood exactly what she meant. "Do not insult my intelligence, Ashford. The entire staff speaks of little else. Your grandmother's companion, the vicar's daughter with no fortune to speak of. I have seen the way you look at her, even in the brief days I have been here." A pause, and Alowan could hear the careful, deliberate patience in Lady Vaughan's next words, the sound of a woman who had clearly given this speech considerable thought before delivering it. "I do not say this to wound you. I say it because we have known each other too long for me to pretend I do not see what is happening. But you must understand, whatever fondness you have developed for this girl, it changes nothing about our obligations. Our families have built this arrangement over decades. My father's political ambitions, your own family's need for stability after everything that happened with your brother. These things do not simply disappear, because a pretty companion caught your eye during a passing infatuation." Alowan felt something cold and sharp lodge itself in her chest at the words passing infatuation, though she could not have said whether the sharper pain came from the dismissal itself, or from the silence that followed it, the Duke offering no immediate objection to Lady Vaughan's characterization of whatever had grown between himself and Alowan over the past weeks. "You are right," he said finally, his voice quiet and strained. "I have obligations I cannot simply set aside." Alowan did not wait to hear more. She moved quickly and quietly away from the door, her heart pounding, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall in the middle of a corridor where anyone might see. She completed her errand for the dowager in a daze, her mind replaying the conversation over and over, each repetition sharpening the hurt rather than dulling it. She saw the Duke only briefly for the remainder of that day, at dinner, where he seemed distracted and quiet, his attention divided uneasily between Lady Vaughan's determined conversation and something else entirely that Alowan could not read from her place at the far end of the table. She did not seek him out afterward, retreating instead to her room as soon as propriety allowed, where she sat by her window for a long while, watching the darkness settle over the grounds, feeling the fragile hope of the past weeks curdle slowly into something closer to grief. She told herself, with as much firmness as she could manage, that this was exactly the outcome she should have expected from the beginning. Dukes did not marry companions, whatever tender words passed between them in libraries and gardens. Lady Vaughan was right, however painful the truth of it was to hear. There were obligations that mattered more than fleeting feelings, arrangements built over decades that could not simply be dissolved, because two people had found an unexpected, inconvenient fondness for one another. And yet, even as she told herself this, even as she prepared herself for the quiet, dignified withdrawal she knew she must undertake in the coming days, she could not entirely silence the small, stubborn voice within her that remembered the raw honesty in his eyes the night he had confessed, however carefully, that he felt something for her he had not expected to feel again. She could not forget the way he had asked, in the rain-soaked dark of that first night, whether she was hurt, as though her answer had genuinely mattered more to him than anything else in the world. Perhaps, she thought, staring out at the darkened grounds, it did not matter what he felt. Perhaps feeling was not enough, when weighed against the vast machinery of duty and family and political ambition that governed a man in his position. Perhaps she had simply been foolish enough to mistake kindness for something deeper, warmth for something that could never be more than a passing, forbidden comfort in a life otherwise governed entirely by obligation. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find Marjorie standing in the corridor, her expression unusually gentle. "I thought you might want this," the housekeeper said, holding out a small cup of warm milk, a kindness Alowan had not expected and found unexpectedly moving given the raw state of her feelings. "You've looked pale all evening, miss. I hope nothing is troubling you." "I am only tired, Marjorie, thank you." The older woman studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes missing nothing, before she spoke again, her voice lowered as though sharing a confidence. "For what it's worth, miss, I have served this family for 30 years. I watched his lordship grow up, watched him bury his brother and his parents both before he was old enough to properly understand what grief even was. I have never, in all that time, seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Whatever comes of Lady Vaughan's visit, I would not be so quick to give up hope entirely." Elowen managed a small, grateful smile, though the ache in her chest remained undiminished by the kindness of the words. "Thank you, Marjorie, truly." The housekeeper nodded and withdrew, leaving Elowen alone once more with her cooling cup of milk and her tangled, uncertain thoughts. She did not know, lying awake long into the night, whether Marjorie's confidence was warranted or simply the well-meaning hope of a woman who had watched too many years pass without the Duke finding any real happiness. She did not know whether the Duke would ultimately honor the old arrangement with Lady Vaughan, bound as he was by decades of family obligation and political necessity, or whether the quiet, fragile connection that had grown between himself and Elowen over the past weeks held any real weight against such powerful forces. She only knew, watching the last of the candlelight flicker and die in her small room, that the coming weeks would demand more courage from both of them than either had yet been asked to show, and that whatever choice the Duke ultimately made would determine far more than the simple question of his own marriage. It would determine, she suspected, the entire shape of whatever future either of them was permitted to have. The weather turned sharply the following week, gray clouds gathering low over the hills surrounding Oswaldby Hall, the air thick with the promise of rain that had not yet broken. Elowen had been sent, along with 2 grooms, to deliver a message to a neighboring farm regarding the estate's autumn harvest arrangements, a task the dowager had entrusted to her more out of a desire to keep her occupied than any real necessity. Elowen suspected, given the careful, watchful kindness the older woman had shown her since Lady Vaughan's arrival. She had not expected the Duke to insist on accompanying her. "The roads have been unreliable since the last storm," he had said at breakfast that morning, his tone carefully neutral though his eyes had held hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I will ride out with you to see the message properly delivered." Lady Vaughan had raised an eyebrow at this but said nothing, occupied instead with a letter from her father that had arrived that morning, and Elowen had not trusted herself to respond beyond a quiet acknowledgment of the arrangement. They set out shortly after breakfast, the 2 grooms trailing at a respectful distance behind, the Duke riding beside Elowen's mount with the same easy, unhurried confidence he brought to everything he did. Neither of them spoke much during the first hour of the ride, the events of the past week hanging unspoken between them, until the sky finally broke open without warning, rain falling in sudden, heavy sheets that soaked through their clothing within minutes. "There is a cottage ahead," the Duke called over the noise of the storm, gesturing toward a small, weathered structure visible through the rain. "The old gamekeeper's lodge. We should take shelter until this passes." The grooms peeled off toward a different, closer shelter with the horses, leaving Elowen and the Duke to make their own way to the cottage, both of them soaked through by the time they reached its door and stumbled inside, breathless and dripping onto the worn wooden floor. The cottage was small and simply furnished, a single room with a stone hearth, a rough table, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall, clearly unused for some time given the layer of dust coating every surface. The Duke moved quickly to the hearth, finding kindling stacked neatly beside it, and within a few minutes had coaxed a small fire to life, the flames casting warm, flickering light across the dim interior. "You are shivering," he observed, glancing at her where she stood near the door, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "So are you," she said, noting the way his own hands trembled slightly as he fed another piece of kindling to the fire. He managed a small, wry smile at that, gesturing for her to come closer to the growing warmth. "Come. There is no sense in either of us catching a chill out of stubbornness." She crossed the small room and settled onto the floor near the hearth, close enough to feel the fire's heat beginning to chase away the worst of the cold, and after a moment's hesitation, he settled beside her, close but not touching, the rain drumming steadily on the roof above them. They sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling softly, the storm raging outside the small, weathered windows, and Elowen found herself acutely aware of every small sound, every shift of his breathing beside her, every moment of quiet that stretched between them heavy with everything neither of them had yet said aloud. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, breaking the silence, his voice low and unsteady in a way she had rarely heard from him. "For what, Your Grace?" "For Lady Vaughan's visit," he said. "For the distance I have kept these past days. For allowing you to believe, even for a moment, that what passed between us in the library meant nothing to me." Eloan's breath caught. "You do not owe me any explanation. You have obligations that supersede whatever fondness we may have developed for one another. Lady Vaughan made that quite clear." His head turned sharply toward her. "You heard our conversation." "I did not mean to," she admitted. "I was passing your study. I should have moved on immediately, but I did not." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, his jaw tight with something that looked almost like anger, though she suspected it was directed inward rather than at her. "Then you heard me say that I have obligations I cannot set aside." "I did." "What you did not hear," he said, turning fully toward her now, his gray eyes catching the firelight with an intensity that made her breath catch, "was everything I did not say afterward because I did not have the courage to say it to Cecilia's face, though I have thought of little else since." "What is it you did not say?" she asked softly, though some part of her already sensed the answer, dangerous and thrilling in equal measure. "That the obligation I feel most keenly," he said, his voice rough, "is not to my family's old arrangement with the Vaughans. It is to whatever this is growing between us that I have been too much of a coward to properly name." Eloan's heart pounded so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it over the rain. "Ashford. I have spent 11 years, he continued, the words coming faster now as though a dam long held had finally begun to break, being exactly what everyone required. Dutiful son, grieving brother, responsible duke. I buried my parents, buried my brother, and rebuilt an estate that was nearly ruined by grief and mismanagement. And in all that time, I do not believe I ever once asked myself what I actually wanted, because wanting seemed like a luxury I could not afford. And now," she whispered. "And now," he said, reaching out slowly, carefully, to brush a strand of damp hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek with a tenderness that made her tremble. "I find that I want you, Eloan Hartley, more than I have wanted anything in longer than I can remember. I want your quiet strength and your sharp tongue, and the way you closed that door without asking a single question you had every right to ask. I want to know what it feels like to build a life with someone who sees me as a man rather than a title, rather than an obligation, rather than a name attached to an inheritance." Tears gathered in Eloan's eyes, though whether from joy or grief or some tangled combination of both, she could not have said. "You cannot mean that. Lady Vaughan is right. Whatever we feel changes nothing about what your family, your position, requires of you." "Look at me," he said softly, his thumb tracing gently along her cheekbone, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that stripped away every careful defense she had built over the past week. "And tell me you feel nothing." The words hung in the small, fire-lit space between them, the rain still hammering steadily on the roof above, and Eloan found she could not speak at all, could not force out the denial that duty and sense demanded of her, because it would have been, quite simply, a lie. "I cannot," she whispered finally, the admission costing her something she could not name, relief and terror tangled together in equal measure. "I feel a great deal more than nothing, and I have from the very first moment you pulled me from that wrecked carriage." Something in his face broke open at her words, relief and hope, and something far more fragile passing across his features before he closed the small remaining distance between them, his hand cradling her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch, his forehead resting against hers for a long, suspended moment before he finally, carefully, closed the last of the distance and kissed her. It was nothing like she had imagined a first kiss might be, gentle where she had expected urgency, careful where she had expected recklessness, as though he were memorizing the shape of the moment rather than simply claiming it. When he finally drew back, his eyes searched hers with a vulnerability she had never seen from him before, not even in the corridor outside his brother's room. "I have wanted to do that since the night in the corridor," he admitted quietly. "When you closed that door without asking a single unkind question, and I understood, for the first time since my brother died, that there might exist a person in this world capable of seeing my grief without wanting to use it against me." "I did not close the door for a reward, Ashford," she said softly, still reeling from the kiss, from the raw honesty in his voice. "I closed it because it was the right thing to do." "I know," he said. "That is precisely why I fell for you as quickly and as helplessly as I did." They sat together for a long while after that, close beside the fire, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm wrapped carefully around her, neither of them speaking much beyond the occasional soft exchange, content simply to exist together in the fragile, stolen warmth of the small cottage while the storm continued to rage outside. "What happens now?" Eloan asked eventually, the question she had been avoiding finally forcing its way free. "Lady Vaughan remains at the Hall. Your family's arrangement with hers has not been formally dissolved." His arm tightened around her slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a new, steady resolve she had not heard from him before this moment. "I will end the arrangement. Properly, honestly, whatever cost it brings to my standing with Lord Vaughan or the wider families who have long expected this match. I cannot in good conscience marry a woman I do not love, not when I have finally understood what it feels like to want someone with my whole heart rather than out of duty." "It will cause scandal," she said, though hope had begun to bloom fiercely in her chest despite every sensible warning she gave herself. "You are a duke. Ending a long-standing arrangement to pursue your grandmother's companion will not be received quietly by society." "I have spent 11 years being careful of scandal," he said, "of protecting a family name that has already survived far worse than the gossip of drawing rooms. I find, sitting here with you, that I am finally prepared to risk it." Eloan turned to look up at him, searching his face for any hint of hesitation or doubt, and found none, only the same steady, unwavering resolve that had first struck her the night he pulled her from the wrecked carriage, calm and certain in the midst of chaos. "Then I will not ask you to be careful on my account," she said softly, "only honest." "I intend to be nothing else from this moment forward," he said, and sealed the promise with another slow, careful kiss that left her breathless and certain, for the first time since Lady Vaughan's arrival, that whatever obstacles remained ahead of them, they would face them together rather than apart. The rain finally began to ease as the afternoon wore on, the storm's fury spending itself against the hills, and eventually they emerged from the small cottage into a world washed clean and glistening, the sky beginning to clear toward the west. The ride back to Oswaldby Hall passed in a different kind of silence than the ride out had, comfortable and warm despite the lingering damp of their clothing, both of them acutely aware that whatever waited for them at the house would test the fragile, hard-won understanding they had reached in the shelter of the gamekeeper's cottage. Eloan did not know, riding back through the clearing storm beside the man she now understood, without any remaining doubt, that she loved, exactly how difficult the coming days would prove to be. She only knew that whatever came next, she would face it having finally spoken the truth of her feelings aloud, and having heard, in return, a truth from him that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, however the larger battle for their future ultimately resolved. "Look at me," he had said, "and tell me you feel nothing." She had not been able to, and in the honest, trembling admission that followed, something irreversible had shifted between them, a beginning neither of them could now retreat from, whatever storms still waited ahead. They returned to Oswaldby Hall as the last light of the day faded into evening, both of them quietly composed by the time the grooms took charge of their horses, though nothing about the careful distance they maintained in front of the household staff could fully erase the warmth that had settled between them since the cottage. Eloan went immediately to change out of her damp clothes, her heart still unsteady with everything that had passed that afternoon, and it was only later, dressing for dinner, that she began to understand how precarious their newfound happiness truly was. Lady Vaughan was waiting for her in the corridor outside the dining room, arms crossed, her earlier pleasant courtesy entirely absent from her expression. "You were gone a long while today," Lady Vaughan said, her voice carrying an edge Aloan had not heard from her before. "Longer than a simple message to a neighboring farm should have required." "The storm delayed our return," Aloan said carefully, keeping her voice even despite the sudden unease pooling in her stomach. "We took shelter until it passed." "How convenient," Lady Vaughan said, "that the storm should provide such an extended opportunity for privacy." Her eyes swept over Aloan with a cold, assessing look that made her feel suddenly, uncomfortably exposed. "I am not a fool, Miss Hartley, whatever you and Ashford might believe. I have known him since we were children. I know the particular way he holds himself when something has changed in him." "I do not know what you are implying," Aloan said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the lie. "I am implying nothing," Lady Vaughan said. "I am stating plainly what I have already begun to suspect for days, and what today's extended absence has now confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. You have set your sights on a duke, Miss Hartley, whatever pretty words of friendship you might use to describe it to yourself. I would advise you to consider very carefully what such ambitions will cost you, because I promise you, they will cost you a great deal." She swept past Aloan without waiting for a response, leaving her standing alone in the corridor with a growing sense of dread that no amount of reasoning could entirely dispel. She managed to compose herself sufficiently for dinner, though she noticed, throughout the meal, the particular sharpness with which Lady Vaughan observed both herself and the Duke, calculating something behind her polite, practiced smile. The blow, when it came, arrived not directly, but through the careful, deliberate machinery of rumor and suggestion that Lady Vaughan set into motion over the following days. It began quietly, a whispered comment to a visiting neighbor about how attentive the Duke had become toward his grandmother's companion, how unusual it was for a man of his position to escort a mere companion through a storm, rather than send a groom in his place. It spread quickly from there, as such things always did, through the careful, deniable channels of polite society, each retelling adding a fresh layer of implication that grew more damaging with every repetition. By the end of the week, the story making its way through the neighboring estates bore little resemblance to the truth, transformed instead into a scandalous tale of an ambitious companion who had contrived to trap the vulnerable, grieving Duke of Oswaldby into an improper alliance, exploiting his loneliness for her own advancement. Aloan learned of the full extent of the rumor only when the Dowager summoned her to her private sitting room, her expression grave in a way Aloan had never seen from her before. "Sit down, Miss Hartley," the Dowager said, and something in her careful use of the formal address, rather than the familiar Aloan she had adopted over the past weeks, told Aloan immediately that whatever was coming would not be welcome news. "Your Grace, Please, sit." Aloan sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I have received 3 letters this morning," the Dowager said, "from acquaintances across the county, each expressing concern over rumors that my grandson has become entangled in an improper relationship with a member of his own household." She paused, her sharp eyes studying Aloan's face with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I will ask you plainly, and I expect an honest answer. Has something occurred between yourself and Ashford?" Aloan's throat tightened. She thought of the cottage, of the fire, of the careful, trembling honesty they had exchanged in the shelter of the storm, and found she could not bring herself to deny it entirely, whatever the cost of admitting the truth might prove to be. "Your Grace, I care for him, deeply, and I believe, though I would never presume to speak for him, that he feels the same." The Dowager closed her eyes briefly, a gesture that carried more weight than any words could have conveyed. "I had suspected as much for some time. I will confess, privately, that I had hoped it might be so, given how much happier my grandson has seemed since your arrival in this house." She opened her eyes again, and Aloan saw, beneath the sharpness, genuine sorrow. "But you must understand the position this places all of us in. Lord Vaughan is furious. He believes his daughter has been publicly humiliated by rumors of my grandson's attachment to another woman, while their family's arrangement remains formally unresolved. He has threatened to bring the matter before the wider society in the most damaging terms possible unless the situation is remedied immediately. What does he demand? Eloin asked, though some cold, sinking part of her already suspected the answer. That you be removed from this household, the dowager said quietly, before the scandal grows beyond any hope of containment, and that my grandson honor the arrangement with his daughter as originally intended. Eloin felt the room tilt slightly around her, the careful, fragile hope she had carried since the cottage crumbling beneath the weight of the dowager's words. And what do you intend to do? The dowager was silent for a long moment, her hands twisting together in her lap, an uncharacteristic display of uncertainty from a woman who had always seemed so entirely in command of herself and her household. I love my grandson, she said finally. I have watched him carry more grief and duty than any young man should be asked to bear, and I have watched him find, for the first time in 11 years, something that looks very much like genuine happiness. I do not wish to be the one who takes that from him. But, Eloin said quietly, sensing the word coming before it arrived. But I am also responsible for the survival of this family's name and standing, the dowager continued, her voice heavy with reluctance. A scandal of this magnitude, arriving so soon after everything this family has already suffered, could undo years of careful rebuilding. I cannot, in good conscience, ignore the danger Lord Vaughan's threats represent, however much it pains me to say so. You intend to send me away, Eloin said, the words falling flat and cold in the quiet room. I intend to give you a choice, the dowager said gently, though the gentleness did nothing to soften the devastating weight of what followed. You may leave quietly, with a generous settlement and a strong letter of reference, before matters escalate further and the scandal grows beyond any possibility of repair. Or you may remain, and watch this family, and the man you claim to love, torn apart by a controversy that will follow him for the rest of his life, regardless of whatever feelings exist between the two of you. Eloin sat in stunned silence, the full weight of the choice settling over her like a physical thing. She thought of Ashford, of everything he had already survived, the death of his parents, the loss of his young brother, the 11 years of careful, exhausting duty he had shouldered without complaint. She thought of the raw, unguarded honesty in his voice in the cottage, the way he had finally allowed himself to want something purely for its own sake rather than out of obligation. And she thought of what it would mean for him to watch that fragile happiness collapse beneath a scandal of Lord Vaughan's making. His family's hard-won stability threatened once again, so soon, after everything else it had already endured. I will go, she said finally, the words costing her more than she had believed any words could cost. The dowager's expression crumpled slightly with something that looked very much like grief. I am sorry, my dear, truly. If circumstances were different, if this family had not already survived so much, I would fight this with everything I have. But I cannot, in good conscience, risk what remains of Ashford's stability on the strength of a feeling, however genuine, that society has already decided to condemn. When must I leave? Tomorrow morning, the dowager said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Ashford has the opportunity to intervene. I am sorry, Eloin. I believe truly that he would try to stop this if given the chance, and I cannot allow that, not when the cost of his resistance would fall on this entire family's future. Eloin understood, hearing this, the full and terrible shape of what the dowager was asking of her. Not simply to leave, but to leave without a proper farewell, without the chance for Ashford to fight for what had grown between them, sparing him a choice the dowager feared he might make wrongly out of love rather than sense. She spent that final night at Oswaldby Hall, packing her few belongings with trembling hands, tears she had refused to shed in front of the dowager finally falling freely once she was alone. She thought of writing to Ashford, of leaving some explanation behind that might soften the blow of her sudden, unexplained departure. But every attempt at the words felt hopelessly inadequate against the enormity of what she needed to say. And in the end, exhausted and heartbroken, she abandoned the effort entirely, trusting that the dowager would find some way to explain what had happened once Eloin was safely away. The carriage arrived before dawn, arranged quietly by the dowager to avoid drawing the attention of the rest of the household. Marjorie met her at the servants' entrance, her weathered face lined with genuine sorrow, and pressed a small parcel of food into her hands for the journey. "I am sorry, miss," the housekeeper said, her voice thick with emotion. "Truly sorry. I meant what I told you weeks ago about how he looks at you. I still believe it, whatever comes of this dreadful business." "Thank you, Marjorie, for everything." Elowen climbed into the waiting carriage, her small case beside her, the parcel of food untouched in her lap, and watched through the window as Oswaldby Hall receded slowly into the pale gray light of early morning, its windows still dark, its master still sleeping, entirely unaware that the woman he loved was being carried away from him before he had any chance to object. She did not know, as the carriage rattled along the same west road where their story had first begun in the wreckage of a storm months before, whether she would ever see Ashford Vane again. She only knew that she had chosen, in the end, to protect him from a battle the dowager believed he could not win, whatever the cost to her own broken heart in the process. The journey back to her father's small parish took the better part of 2 days, and Elowen spent much of it staring out at the passing countryside, replaying every stolen moment of her time at Oswaldby Hall, from the terrifying wreck that had first thrown her into Ashford's path, to the quiet corridor outside his brother's room, to the fire-lit cottage where he had finally asked her, so softly, to tell him she felt nothing, and she had found with her whole trembling heart that she could not. She arrived at her father's modest house exhausted and hollowed out by grief, and though he welcomed her home with genuine warmth and concern, she found she could not bring herself, in those first difficult days, to explain the full truth of what had happened at Oswaldby Hall, offering instead only a vague account of changed circumstances requiring her return. She did not know, settling back into the small, familiar rhythms of her old life, whether Ashford would ever learn the true reason for her sudden departure, or whether, upon learning it, he would have the courage and the freedom to come after her. She only knew that she had left behind, in the grand, storm-battered walls of Oswaldby Hall, a piece of her heart she suspected she would never fully recover, whatever the coming months might bring. And in the quiet, aching weeks that followed, she waited, with a hope she could not entirely extinguish despite every reasonable argument against it, for some word, some sign, that the man who had once pulled her from a wrecked carriage with such calm, unshakable certainty might yet find his way back to her. Ashford discovered Elowen's absence within hours of waking, and the discovery struck him with a force that left him momentarily unable to think clearly at all. He had gone, as he did most mornings, to the small study where she conducted the dowager's correspondence, expecting to find her there with her careful, steady hand moving across the page, and had found instead an empty room, untouched papers still stacked neatly on the desk from the day before. He found his grandmother in her private sitting room, her face pale and drawn, and understood, the moment their eyes met, that something irreversible had happened. "Where is she?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet in a way that made the dowager flinch despite her considerable resolve. "Ashford, sit down, let me explain." "Where is Elowen?" he said again, refusing to move, refusing to sit, every line of his body rigid with a growing, desperate fear. The dowager explained, haltingly at first and then with increasing urgency, everything that had transpired over the past days, the rumors spreading through the county, Lord Vaughan's furious threats, the impossible choice she had felt compelled to present to Elowen the previous evening. Ashford listened in silence, his face growing paler and more rigid with every word, until finally, when the dowager fell silent, he spoke with a coldness she had never heard from him before, not even in the darkest days following his brother's death. "You sent her away, without telling me, without giving me any chance to object." "I did it to protect you," the dowager said, her voice breaking slightly. "To protect this family, everything we have rebuilt since your parents died, since Thaddeus." "Do not speak my brother's name as justification for this," Ashford said sharply, the first true anger she had ever seen from him directed toward her. I have spent 11 years honoring obligations that were never mine to choose, grandmother. I honored my father's expectations for this estate. I honored the memory of a brother I could not save. I honored, for longer than I should have, an arrangement with the Vaughn family that I never once agreed to in any way that mattered. And now you have taken from me the one thing I finally chose entirely for myself, without asking me, without trusting me to make my own decision about what risks I was willing to bear. Ashford, I am going after her, he said, already turning toward the door. Lord Vaughan will not simply forget this scandal because you chase after a companion, the dowager said, rising quickly, real fear in her voice now. If you go after her, if you make this public, you risk everything, our standing, this family's future, everything I have spent my entire life protecting. Ashford paused at the door, turning back to face her with an expression that held equal parts sorrow and unshakable resolve. I understand what I risk, grandmother. But I have finally come to understand something else as well, something it took losing Alohan to see clearly. What good is protecting this family's name, this family's future, if I am not permitted to live any actual life within it? What good is any of it, if I spend the whole of my existence honoring obligations that leave no room for genuine happiness? He left the room before she could answer, and spent the remainder of that day arranging his affairs with the same swift, decisive efficiency he brought to every crisis, sending word to his steward, arranging for his absence to be covered in whatever business required immediate attention, and finally, in the late afternoon, summoning Lady Vaughan to the same study where she had spoken so confidently of old arrangements and family obligations weeks before. You wish to speak with me, Lady Vaughan said, seating herself across from him with her usual composed grace, though something in his expression seemed to give her pause. I have made my decision regarding our family's arrangement, he said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to say. I cannot marry you, Cecilia. I understand the difficulty this creates for you and for your father, and I take full responsibility for whatever consequences follow. But I will not enter a marriage built on obligation rather than genuine affection, not when I have finally understood what it feels like to want something, someone, entirely for its own sake. Lady Vaughan's composed expression finally cracked, something raw and hurt flashing across her features before she mastered it once more. Because of her, the companion. Because of Alohan, yes, he said, but also, Cecilia, because of you. You deserve a husband who wants to marry you, not one who does so out of decades-old obligation neither of us ever properly chose. I do not believe, in your heart, that you truly want that either. She was silent for a long moment, studying him with an expression he could not entirely read, before finally, unexpectedly, something like reluctant understanding settled over her features. My father will be furious. I know. There will be talk, a great deal of it, and none of it kind to either of us. I know that as well, he said, and I am sorry for whatever difficulty this causes you genuinely. But I cannot, in good conscience, continue pretending this arrangement serves either of our real interests any longer. Lady Vaughan rose slowly, smoothing her skirts with a composed, deliberate motion, though her eyes remained bright with unshed tears she clearly refused to let fall in front of him. I suppose I should thank you in time for the honesty, however unwelcome it feels today. She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression that held something surprisingly close to genuine respect. I hope she is worth everything you are about to lose, Ashford, for your sake. She is, he said simply, and Lady Vaughan nodded once before leaving the room, taking with her the last remnant of the old arrangement that had shadowed his life for so many years. The public dissolution of the arrangement, when it became known over the following days, generated exactly the scandal the dowager had feared, whispered speculation, and pointed gossip spreading through every drawing-room in the county, Lord Vaughan's furious letters arriving with increasing frequency, several long-standing family friendships cooling noticeably in the aftermath. Ashford weathered all of it with a steady, unbothered calm that surprised even himself, understanding, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, that the opinion of society mattered a great deal less to him than the simple, urgent need to find Alohan, and make right the wrong that had been done to her. He rode out for her father's parish 3 days after her departure, refusing his grandmother's careful suggestion that he wait until the immediate scandal had settled somewhat, refusing too the dowager's offer of a proper carriage and escort, choosing instead to ride alone, urgently, as though every hour of delay represented a wound he could not bear to leave unaddressed. The journey took the better part of 2 days, much of it spent turning over in his mind everything he intended to say to her, every apology, every explanation, every promise he needed to make in order to right the terrible wrong of her sudden, unexplained departure. He thought of the wrecked carriage on the West Road, of pulling her from the mud and rain with a calm he had not entirely understood himself, of the moment in the gallery when she had told him her name, and he had felt, for the first time in 11 years, something stir in him that was not simply duty or grief. He thought of the closed door of his brother's room, of her quiet, undemanding kindness in the face of his most private sorrow. He thought of the cottage, the fire, the words he had spoken so carefully, "Look at me, and tell me you feel nothing," and the trembling, honest admission that had followed. He arrived at the small parish on the evening of the second day, exhausted and travel-worn, his horse lathered from the hard, urgent pace he had maintained for most of the journey. The vicarage was a modest, well-kept house at the edge of the village, smoke rising steadily from its chimney against the darkening sky, and Ashford dismounted at the gate with hands that trembled slightly, whether from exhaustion or nerves he could not entirely say. An older man answered his knock, tall and thin with kind, tired eyes that studied Ashford's fine, but travel-stained clothing with evident surprise. "May I help you, sir?" "I am looking for Miss Elowen Hartley," Ashford said. "I believe this is her father's house." Something shifted in the older man's expression, understanding dawning slowly. "You would be the Duke, then?" "I confess I did not expect you to come in person." "You know who I am." "My daughter told me a great deal in the days since her return," the vicar said, his tone carefully neutral, though Ashford sensed a father's protective concern beneath the words. "Enough that I understand why you might have made this journey. I must ask, Your Grace, whether you have come to offer her further heartache, or whether you have come with something more honest to offer." "I have come," Ashford said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability of the admission, "to ask her forgiveness for a choice that was taken from both of us before either of us had any say in it, and to ask whether she might still be willing to build a future with a man who was too slow to understand what he stood to lose." The vicar studied him for a long moment, and whatever he found in Ashford's face seemed eventually to satisfy him. "She is in the garden," he said finally, stepping back to allow Ashford entry. "Through that gate to the left. She goes there most evenings since her return. I believe she finds it easier to think there." Ashford thanked him and made his way through the small, tidy house and out into the modest garden beyond, his heart pounding harder than it had during the entire 2-day journey, harder even than it had during the storm on the West Road so many months before. He found her standing near a small stone bench, her back to him, watching the last light of evening fade over the surrounding fields, and for a long moment he simply stood at the garden's edge, drinking in the sight of her, allowing himself to fully feel the enormity of everything he had traveled this distance to say. "Elowen," he said softly. She turned, and the expression that crossed her face, disbelief giving way slowly to hope, hope giving way to something that looked almost like fear that she might be imagining him entirely, struck him with a force that nearly brought him to his knees right there in her father's small garden. "Ashford," she whispered, "you should not have come, the scandal your family's standing." "I do not care about the scandal," he said, closing the distance between them with quick, urgent steps. "I care about you, Elowen, and about the terrible wrong that was done to both of us when you were sent away without any chance to fight for what we had built together." "Your grandmother believed she was protecting you," Elowen said, though her voice trembled with everything she was clearly trying to hold back. "I know," he said, "and I understand why she believed it necessary, But she was wrong, Alowan, and I have spent every mile of this journey understanding more clearly exactly how wrong she was. He stopped before her, close enough now to see the tears gathering in her eyes, close enough to reach out and gently cup her face in his hands, the same tender gesture he had offered her in the cottage weeks before. "I ended the arrangement with Lady Vaughan," he said. "Publicly, irrevocably. There is scandal following me even now, whispered through every drawing room between here and Oswaldby Hall, and I find I do not care in the slightest, because none of it matters half so much as the simple truth I should have fought harder to protect from the very beginning." "What truth?" she whispered, though he suspected from the hope blooming fiercely in her expression that she already knew. "That I love you," he said, the words simple and unguarded and entirely true. "That I have loved you since a wrecked carriage first put you in my path, and that I am done, entirely and permanently, with allowing duty and obligation to dictate the shape of my own happiness. I have come to ask whether you might still be willing to build a life with me, Alowan, whatever difficulty and scandal it might still cost us both." Alowan's tears finally fell freely, though her expression carried nothing but joy, and she reached up to cover his hand where it still cradled her face, holding it there as though she could not quite believe he was truly standing before her. "Look at me," she said softly, echoing his own words back to him with trembling certainty, "and tell me you will not change your mind again when duty comes calling." He smiled then, the first truly unguarded smile she had seen from him since the night in the corridor, and pulled her gently into his arms. "I will not change my mind, Alowan. Not now, not ever. I promise you that with everything I am." And there in the quiet, fading light of her father's small garden, surrounded by the ordinary, unremarkable beauty of a modest country parish, Ashford Vane, Duke of Oswaldby, finally kissed the woman he loved without duty, without obligation, without the weight of 11 years of careful, dutiful restraint standing between them. And Alowan hardly understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her heart, that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, they would face them together at last. Exactly as they had both always wanted. The days following Ashford's arrival at the vicarage passed in a warm, disbelieving haze for Alowan, each morning bringing fresh confirmation that the man she loved had truly come for her, truly meant every word spoken in her father's quiet garden, truly intended to build a life with her regardless of whatever scandal still followed his name through the drawing rooms of the county. Her father, though initially cautious given the enormous difference in station between his daughter and the man now courting her so openly, found himself quickly won over by Ashford's evident sincerity, the two men spending long hours in quiet conversation over tea, while Alowan watched with a growing sense of wonder at how naturally the Duke of Oswaldby seemed to fit into the modest rhythms of the vicarage, helping to mend a fence one afternoon, discussing scripture with genuine interest another. Showing none of the careless condescension her father had perhaps feared from a man of such elevated position. "He is not what I expected," her father admitted one evening, after Ashford had returned to the inn where he had taken rooms for the duration of his stay, unwilling to further compromise Alowan's reputation by remaining under the same roof despite the obvious impropriety already surrounding their reunion. "I confess, I feared some careless nobleman trifling with my daughter's affections. I find instead a man who seems genuinely humbled by whatever he has found in you." "He has had a difficult life, father," Alowan said softly. "More difficult than most people know, given how carefully he has always guarded it." "Then it is fortunate," her father said, "that he found someone capable of seeing past the title to the man underneath. I do not believe such fortune comes often, in either direction." Word of the broken engagement and Ashford's pursuit of Alowan spread quickly through society, exactly as the dowager had feared, generating weeks of intense speculation and gossip that neither Ashford nor Alowan could entirely escape. Lord Vaughan, true to his earlier threats, attempted to press the matter further, spreading increasingly exaggerated accounts of the Duke's supposed impropriety, but found, to his evident frustration, that Ashford's calm, unashamed public acknowledgment of his feelings for Alowan left little fertile ground for the kind of scandal he had hoped to cultivate. There was no impropriety to expose, no secret to threaten, only a duke who had made the unusual but not scandalous choice to marry a woman of lesser fortune for love rather than advantage. A story that, while unusual, held nothing genuinely damaging within it once the full truth became known. The dowager, for her part, arrived at the vicarage nearly 3 weeks after Ashford's initial departure, having spent the intervening time managing the worst of the immediate scandal from Oswaldby Hall, while also, Eowyn suspected, wrestling with her own considerable guilt over the choice she had forced upon Eowyn that difficult morning. "I owe you an apology," the dowager said, finding Eowyn alone in the garden much as Ashford had weeks before. "A far more complete apology than I gave my grandson when he confronted me over your departure." "You believed you were protecting him," Eowyn said, without bitterness, understanding now the genuine fear that had driven the older woman's difficult decision. "I do not hold it against you, your grace." "You are more generous than I deserve," the dowager said, settling onto the garden bench beside her with a weariness that spoke of the difficult weeks she had endured. "I have watched that boy carry more grief than any child should be asked to bear, watched him grow into a man who believed duty was the only currency worth valuing, and when I finally saw him find something like genuine happiness, I chose fear over faith in his own judgment. It was a mistake I will regret for the rest of my life." "You need not regret it any longer," Eowyn said gently. "He came for me. Whatever fear drove your choice, it did not succeed in keeping us apart, and I believe, in time, this family will find itself stronger for the honesty of what has happened rather than weaker." The dowager reached out and took Eowyn's hand in both of her own, an unusual display of affection from a woman not given to such gestures. "I would be honored, Eowyn, if you would allow me to welcome you properly into this family. As the granddaughter, I never had the fortune to raise myself." Tears gathered in Eowyn's eyes at the unexpected warmth of the offer. "I would like that very much, your grace." "Please," the dowager said, squeezing her hand gently, "call me grandmother, as my grandson does. I believe, given everything that has passed between us, we have earned that particular familiarity." The wedding took place at Oswaldby Hall the following spring, a smaller, quieter affair than society perhaps expected of a duke, held in the same long gallery where Ashford had first learned Eowyn's given name months before, surrounded by the watchful portraits of ancestors who had, in their own time, no doubt faced their own difficult choices between duty and desire. Eowyn's father performed the ceremony himself, his voice steady with evident pride, despite the tears that gathered in his eyes as he pronounced his daughter married to the man who had traveled 2 full days on horseback simply to ask her forgiveness. Marjorie wept openly throughout the ceremony, insisting afterward that she had known. From the very first morning she watched the Duke linger over breakfast waiting for Eowyn's arrival, that something extraordinary was building between them. The rest of the household staff, who had watched the whole slow, careful courtship unfold over the preceding months, celebrated the occasion with a warmth that spoke of genuine affection for both the bride and groom rather than mere obligatory duty toward their employers. Lady Vaughan, somewhat to Eowyn's surprise, sent a brief but gracious letter of well wishes shortly after the wedding, having, in the month since Ashford's difficult confession, found her own happiness with a gentleman of her father's eventual choosing, a match that suited her considerably better than the old, dutiful arrangement with Ashford ever had. Eowyn kept the letter, understanding it as a quiet, generous gesture of peace between 2 women who had never truly been enemies, merely caught together in the difficult machinery of family obligation and expectation. In the years that followed, Eowyn came to understand Oswaldby Hall not as the vast, unfamiliar house that had once intimidated her upon her first storm-soaked arrival, but as a genuine home, warmed by the steady, quiet happiness she and Ashford had built together against every reasonable expectation of their vastly different stations. The nursery that had stood closed and untouched for 11 years, the small room she had once discovered by accident in a dim corridor, was finally reopened, its dusty furniture cleared away and replaced with new, warmer things, when Eowyn delivered their first child, a daughter with her mother's sharp eyes and her father's steady, watchful calm. Ashford proved, over time, exactly the kind of husband and father Aloan had glimpsed in him during those careful, stolen conversations in the library and garden. Patient and thoughtful, quick to laughter in ways that would have astonished the household staff who had known him only as the cold, composed duke of his earlier years. Fiercely devoted to the family he had built with a woman's society, had once considered entirely beneath his station. He never entirely lost the quiet weight of grief he carried for his lost brother and parents, but Aloan watched, over the years, as that grief softened gradually into something more like gentle remembrance rather than raw, unhealed wound. The presence of his own growing family slowly filling the emptiness that had shadowed him for so long. The dowager lived long enough to see 2 more grandchildren born into the family she had once feared losing to scandal, delighting openly in each new arrival, her earlier caution giving way entirely to unrestrained joy at the family Ashford and Aloan had built together. She often told the story, in her later years, of a stormy night on the West Road when a wrecked carriage had brought together 2 people fate had clearly always intended to find one another, though she was careful, in the telling, to leave out her own difficult role in nearly separating them permanently. A detail Aloan never held against her given the genuine love the older woman showed for her family in every year that followed. Aloan thought often, in the quiet moments of her new life, of that first terrifying night on the West Road, of the calm, steady voice asking whether she was hurt as the rain poured down around them both, of the closed door and the quiet corridor and the fire-lit cottage where he had finally asked her so softly to tell him she felt nothing, and she had found she could not. She understood now, with the clarity that only comes from years of hard-won happiness, that the wrecked carriage on that stormy night had not been the disaster it first appeared, but rather the beginning of everything genuinely good that followed, the accident that had finally, irreversibly, brought together a grieving duke and a penniless vicar's daughter who together had built a life neither of them could have imagined possible on that first frightening night. She had come to Oswaldby Hall expecting nothing more than quiet, temporary employment. She left it, years later on her own wedding day, as its duchess, its mistress, and most importantly, as the woman Ashford Vane had chosen, entirely and permanently, over every obligation and expectation his position had ever placed upon him. "Look at me," he had once asked her, "and tell me you feel nothing." She had not been able to then, and in all the years that followed, she never once found reason to regret the trembling, honest truth she had given him instead. 10 years into their marriage, a harsh winter settled over the county, unlike anything the tenants of Oswaldby had seen in a generation. Snow piling so deep against the cottages of the estate's farming families that several roofs threatened to collapse under the weight, and the river that ran along the eastern boundary froze solid enough to halt the mills that ground flour for half the parish. Aloan, now thoroughly at home in her role as Duchess, organized relief efforts with the same quiet, practical determination that had first drawn Ashford to her, opening the hall's stores of grain and firewood to any tenant family in need, while Ashford rode out personally through the worst of the storms to check on the more remote farms, refusing to send stewards in his place despite Aloan's worried protests. "You are not indestructible," she told him one evening, helping him out of a coat stiff with frozen snow, her hands trembling slightly with the fear she had carried all day while he was out in the weather. "Our children need their father returned to them whole, not lost to some frozen ditch, because pride would not let you send someone else in your place. I could not in good conscience ask a steward to face whether I was unwilling to face myself," he said, though his voice softened at the genuine worry in her face. "But you are right to be angry with me. I will take Whitfield with me tomorrow, and we will not stay out past dark." It was during this difficult winter that their eldest daughter, now 9 years old and already displaying her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's quiet steadiness, first asked about the uncle she had never known, having found, while exploring the house on a snowbound afternoon, an old portrait of a boy with dark hair and a mischievous smile tucked away in a rarely used sitting room. "Papa," she asked that evening, climbing into Ashford's lap by the fire in a manner she was perhaps growing slightly too old for, but which neither parent had the heart to discourage. "Who is the boy in the painting upstairs?" "He has your same eyes." Ashford went very still, and Aloan, watching from across the room, felt her own heart clench in sympathy, understanding immediately which portrait their daughter had found. "That was my brother," Ashford said finally, his voice carrying a gentleness that had grown into the grief over the years, softened by time though never entirely erased. "His name was Thaddeus. He died when he was very young, younger than you are now." Their daughter considered this with the grave seriousness children often bring to such revelations. "Do you miss him?" "Every single day," Ashford said honestly. "But I have learned over many years that missing someone and being happy are not opposites. I can hold both feelings at once." It was Aloan who suggested, later that winter, once the worst of the storms had passed and the roads had cleared enough for travel, that the old nursery wing, long since transformed for their own growing family, might benefit from properly honoring Thaddeus's memory rather than simply setting his portrait aside in a forgotten room. Together, she and Ashford chose a small, sunny corner of the family sitting room for the portrait, a place where it could be seen and remembered daily rather than hidden away in shadow. And Ashford found, to his own quiet surprise, that having his brother's face present in their daily life brought him a peace he had not expected after so many years of careful avoidance. "I spent so long trying to protect myself from the grief," he admitted to Aloan one evening, the portrait now hanging where the whole family could see it, their children occasionally pausing to ask questions about the uncle they had never known. "I understand now that all that careful avoidance did was keep the wound from ever properly healing. Grief does not disappear simply because we hide it away," Aloan said, echoing something close to what she had felt instinctively that first night in the corridor, so many years before. "But it can become something gentler, something we carry more easily, when we are finally brave enough to let it breathe." The estate recovered from the harsh winter. By the following spring, tenant families grateful for the Duke and Duchess's evident care during the crisis, their reputation throughout the county growing not from grand society gatherings or careful political maneuvering, but from the genuine, hands-on concern both of them showed for the well-being of everyone under their protection. It became, over the years, something of a hallmark of their household, the Duke and Duchess of Oswaldby known not merely for their unusual love match, still occasionally whispered about in drawing rooms years after the fact, but for the practical, unpretentious way they conducted the business of running a great estate. Their family grew steadily over the following years, 3 children eventually filling the halls of Oswaldby with laughter that the old house had not heard in generations, each child inheriting some particular blend of their parents' character, sharp minds and steady hearts, curiosity and quiet resolve. Aloan watched, with a satisfaction she had never dared imagine possible during her uncertain early days as a penniless companion, as the vast, imposing house that had once intimidated her upon her stormy first arrival slowly transformed, year by year, into something unmistakably like a home, full of warmth and noise, and the particular, irreplaceable comfort of a family built on genuine choice rather than obligation. The dowager in her final years took particular delight in her great-grandchildren, spending long afternoons in the garden teaching them the names of flowers she had once tended with Ashford's own mother, occasionally recounting, with evident fondness, the story of the stormy night that had first brought Aloan into their family, though she never failed, in the telling, to credit her grandson's stubborn, unshakable persistence in fighting for what he wanted rather than settling for what duty demanded. When the dowager passed peacefully in her sleep some years later, surrounded by the family she had once feared she might lose to scandal and grief, Aloan found, standing beside Ashford at the funeral, that she could finally understand the full weight of everything the older woman had carried and ultimately overcome in choosing, at last, to trust love over fear. Ashford himself grew, over the years, into precisely the kind of duke his younger self might never have believed possible, respected not for the cold, composed distance he had once maintained as protection against further loss, but for the genuine warmth and fairness he brought to every aspect of his responsibilities, a transformation the older tenants of the estate often remarked upon, comparing the careworn young man who had once seemed so burdened by grief to the settled, contented figure he had grown into with Alowan steadily beside him. On quiet evenings, long after their children had grown and built lives of their own, Ashford and Alowan would often walk together through the same garden path where he had first confessed, so many years before, the trouble weighing on him after Lady Vaughan's letter arrived, the same fountain where Pepper the dog had once splashed contentedly while their fragile understanding first began to form. They rarely spoke of those difficult early days anymore. The wreck and the closed door and the painful separation Lord Vaughan's rumors had once forced upon them, the memories having softened over the decades into something closer to fondness than pain. But occasionally, on the anniversary of that first stormy meeting, Ashford would take Alowan's face gently in his hands, the same tender gesture he had first offered in the fire-lit cottage, and repeat, softly, the words that had once changed the entire course of both their lives. "Look at me," he would say, "and tell me you feel nothing." And every single time, across all the years of their marriage, through every difficulty and joy that followed, Alowan would answer him exactly as she had that very first time, with nothing but the trembling, honest truth. She had never once, in all the years since, been able to tell him she felt nothing at all.